I'd like now to welcome our first guest speaker of the evening, the Deputy Leader and Minister of Finance, the Hon Bill English.
I think your address illustrated that we're all having a much more in-depth conversation about this issue than would have been possible just 3 or 4 years ago, and that represents, I think, a huge step forward. I just want to run over the main motivations for the government's interest in this, and then one or two issues that have arisen out of the reasonably intense engagement we've had with this issue over the last 2 or 3 years. I think I'd start though by saying that we've all had to learn a lot. Central government, I think as recently as just 3 years ago, had very little understanding of housing markets, even though it's our largest asset class, and in fact the largest asset owned by the government, which is Housing Corp, 17 billion, larger than all SOEs put together. Not exactly the sign of great stewardship that the government didn't know where its largest asset fitted in a market it didn't understand. So we're changing all that. The other thing that central government has had to learn are the complexities and pressures on local government. They're the key decision maker in this market, and our understanding of the sort of implied economic models, the complexities of the planning process, the impact of legislation on that process, the impact of communities on that process is really only just starting to get deep enough to be able to think ahead about where it should go. But there's 3 reasons why we focus and will continue to focus on this issue if we have the privilege of being re-elected. One is, as Lawrence has pointed out, the macroeconomic impacts of a housing market. I think there's now a pretty good understanding that fast rising housing market alters our interest rate track, which can alter our exchange rate track. So decisions made in Auckland impact on households in Invercargill. And people have a pretty intuitive grip of that now. One of the most regular questions I get in my post-budget trips around the country is whether or not we could have regional LVRs. So people can see that is the case. We're all in it together. Our macroeconomic variables are pushed around by decisions made in planning departments and councils. And I think that's much more clearly understood than it used to be. The second reason we're focused is the exposure of the taxpayer to the housing market. And this I think, needs to be better understood. The one is just what we now understand as the sovereign risk associated with runaway housing markets. In New Zealand, we have now got much more highly leveraged households than we used to have. And the growth in those debt levels has been one of the dynamics feeding house prices in the last 30 years that won't be there in the next 30 years. So back in the 70s and 80s, you often had to have, you could sometimes only borrow up to 40 or 50% of the value of the house. In the boom in the 90s, that rose to 75%, and in the last boom in the early 2000s, it rose to 95 to 100%. Well, it can't go any higher. But house prices have been fed by that big increase in debt in the financial system and in our households. That has created, as we've learnt in New Zealand on a small scale, and Spain and Ireland on a massive scale, a large contingent liability through the banking system for taxpayers. And Ireland and Spain are the marquee examples of it. This market is sufficiently large that bad decisions associated with it can stuff sovereign finances for a generation. That is a massive exposure, and any responsible government in New Zealand will try to reduce that exposure. And the international financial system is going to help us, because banking regulation and offshore lenders are simply not going to lend us the money in the future just to save us from ourselves. In any case, we're topped up with debt. Why would they? So that's a kind of one-off risk. You know, if it occurs, we're really down the tubes, and it'll take us 25 years to get over it. It'll cost us hundreds of billions, and we want to reduce that possibility. The other exposure is the subsidisation that goes on to fill the gap between household incomes and the cost of servicing the housing market. Some of that subsidy is explicit. We subsidise 40% of all private rentals in New Zealand through the accommodation supplement and accommodation benefit. We have a subsidy at least as large through our provision of social housing. The opportunity cost of holding 17 billion of assets that have not been that well looked after. You could also argue, and I certainly do, that there's no coincidence that in the period when house prices doubled up to 2008, working for families was massively expanded, early childhood subsidies expanded dramatically. We took the dramatic step of moving to interest-free student loans, all of which enabled middle and low income households to get enough cash in to service their mortgages. So I would argue that's another 4 to 6 billion of subsidy, where housing costs drive the need for the taxpayer to fill the gap. And you will see in the run-up to this election a lot of discussion about exactly that issue, about what governments can promise to help fill the gap, the affordability gap. So that's a second reason we're very interested in it. The exposure of the taxpayer to large-scale sovereign risk through the banking system and the fiscal subsidies which cost you billions a year to fill the income gap. The third reason is fairness. One of the features of New Zealand is that income inequality hasn't increased much, hasn't changed actually in about the last 15 years. It's simply not correct that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. It's pretty flat. We don't have good measures of wealth or asset inequality, but you can be sure that if we do, they will show that housing is the main driver of that inequality. So that's another reason in New Zealand we should be concerned about it. 15% compound house price increases is building massively, much faster than changes in incomes, building inequality. And if we're worried about it, the single most important thing we can do actually is get our housing market operating more efficiently. Good, straightforward economic efficiency in the housing market, regulatory efficiency will bring about a fairer community, particularly in allowing more low and middle income people in. There's no point in having beautifully designed cities if 90% of New Zealanders can't afford to live in them. Okay, we might have to get a bit ugly, but actually a lot of people live in New Zealand on relatively low incomes and their housing is never going to look that flash. So why don't we get practical and work with the market as it is? We don't live in Switzerland or Hong Kong or Singapore. So fairness is going to be, for any government in New Zealand, a compelling driver to sort these problems out. The good news is that we're making some progress, but man, it's difficult. Lawrence has already averted to the complexity of housing. And I'm sure that particularly our councillors here can tell us what it's like trying to wrestle with that complexity. In fact, when you look at our planning system, which is a legislated one, it's not the product of what council's choices, it's what the country, the central government has legislated. It's a wonder that anyone can make much sense of it. If it takes us 10 years, as we were advised, to get a legitimate Auckland plan up and running, that's a bad system. And we've worked very constructively with the Auckland City Council to shorten that to 3 years. And with the special housing areas, they've been even more pragmatic and enabled changes to occur within 1 or 2 years. And now we're finding councils, as they understand special housing areas, are keen to sign up to them, even when they're not required, because it enables them to avoid the complexities of their own plan. So we've got a pretty difficult intellectual endeavour here, which is to reflect the very real pressures that councils have to deal with in the micromanagement of communities street by street, where political pressures are in many respects stronger than they are in central government. Enable those to be dealt with at the same time as we address the externalities that I've talked about, where the impacts of those localised decisions are nationally very significant. It's been great to see the way that I think everyone's involved in this discussion has realised there's a lot of things they don't know about the other points of view, and have invested intensively in trying to deal with it. Some of it is a governance issue. When you try and wade through the hundreds and hundreds of pages of plans, you just wonder how any individual in either management or particularly the unprofessional councillor, by definition they should be, can exercise any influence over it. Occasionally I think we've got a beast here born out of the RMA from the late 80s and early 90s, a beast that is maybe in its current form untamable, and that is why we keep going for these pragmatic, shorter term type solutions. Well, they'll get us so far, but if we want to achieve the objectives of fairness and financial stability and macroeconomic balance, then we may need to, in the longer term, think about some more lasting solutions. Thank you.